And let me add to that. It is terrifying I mean, this is a friendly audience, it seems, but to go into an environment that if you're an academic in particular, you're used to audiences that are quite sympathetic, and it is very difficult to go the first time you do it to an audience that might not be. But in fact, I think it's, well, give you an example. I was on Fox News a few years ago, and well, news is, I don't like to use that word when I went Fox, but I was on Hannity and Combs, okay, and I was debating at that time with the heads of the Southern Baptist Coalition. And I felt, couldn't get a word in edgewise, clearly I got yelled down, but I did make a single statement, which was said without interruption, happily, and it was that you don't have to be an atheist to accept evolution. And I got more mail from people who accused me, in fact, of being humble, which was the first time I'd gotten that, but people who have been told every week in church and everywhere else that science is akin to atheism. And I think the point we've made is that atheism is irrelevant, God is irrelevant to science. Evolution happened regardless of what you believe. So I think that single statement, even though I felt intellectually raped after that program, was worth going on the program and saying, because I think that's the kind of thing we need to counter, those lies about science.
I quite like to just sort of disagree with Lawrence for the first time this evening. I quite like the idea that people are being taught in their churches that evolution is incompatible with God, because we absolutely can demonstrate that evolution is a fact.
Good point. Good point. Well, I'll take that one. That's good. Yes.
Personally, I just want to say that if as many people watch the Super Bowl, watch this, we'd have a better society. So.
And if they paid as much for our commercials, then it'd be a much better.
You're right. You're absolutely right. My name is Ben Fama Jr. I'm a student documentary filmmaker. I'm making a film called A Virus Called Fear. And briefly, I was wondering if you can give me an input on how we went from having rational fear to like not get eaten by tigers and bears, and how we came to irrational fears like politics and religion.
Did you hear that?
I didn't hear. The problem is the loudspeakers are facing the audience. Should
I speak a little bit louder? Can you hear me?
No, not louder, slower.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm from Las Vegas. Everything's really fast.
There's an echo here, that's all.
I was wondering if briefly you can talk about fear and how it was a biological safety net for us to not get eaten by tigers, and how you feel that it evolved to irrational fears like politics and religion.
Okay, that's a very interesting thought. Certainly, fear would be a very valuable biological mechanism, because our ancestors would have lived perilous lives. They'd have been frightened of predators, lions, saber-tooths, no, probably not saber-tooths, and leopards. They would have had disease would have swooped without warning, without explanation, so they would naturally have tried to think of ways to avoid these terrible dangers. In the case of disease, which before modern science was completely unpredictable, unknowable, one would naturally fall into superstitious habits. I scratched my left ear, and something terrible happened. So maybe I should make sure I don't scratch my left ear again. These are superstitious responses, and when you're living in a world of ignorance, then if you're governed by fear, you could very well make up superstitions. Pigeons do it in Skinner boxes. Skinner himself did a very interesting experiment in which he put pigeons in a Skinner box is a cage in which if the pigeon does something like peck a key, it gets a reward, and pigeons readily learn to do that. Skinner put his pigeons in Skinner boxes where absolutely nothing that the pigeon did had any effect whatever, but nevertheless at random rewards were delivered, okay, which is sort of like our ancestors' world. And then if he came back after a few hours and saw half a dozen pigeons under this regime, One pigeon would be preening under its left wing, another would be turning round in circles, another would be scratching the ground, another would be wiping its head on the ground, and another would be facing into the bottom left-hand corner. Each pigeon had superstitiously done something, accidentally been rewarded because that's when the mechanism produced the food, and carried on doing it. And so each pigeon became a kind of maniac for doing a particular ritual, which is exactly like one tribe sacrifices a goat in order to make the rains come. Another tribe gets down on its knees and faces Mecca and prays 5 times a day, whatever it is. Each tribe develops its own superstition in order to get rewarded, and of course in order to avoid being punished, in order to avoid the fearful consequences of random events which they had no control over. Nowadays, increasingly, we understand where danger comes from. We know where disease comes from. We don't know exactly, but approximately. We know how to control our world to an increasing extent, so we can afford to throw away those superstitions. Unfortunately, enormous numbers of us, the great majority of people on this planet, have failed to wean themselves off these primitive superstitions.
Let me just add one thing, because this was a difference. Well, I'm happy to applaud that, in fact. But because this is, I remember from an earlier discussion, we disagreed a little bit about this, but because Richard lives in Oxford, and I have to remind him that people are irrational as well as rational. That I think irrationality is a central part of being human. We need it. Each of us, every day, has to believe 10 impossible things before breakfast. To get up, you have to believe you love your wife, or you like your job, or whatever it is, and it's, you know, and you're lying to yourself half the time, but we need it to get through life, and I think it's just, I do think there is probably an evolutionary basis of that at some level. To face with a universe that doesn't care about your existence, you often have to invent realities just to motivate yourself to go on living.
Robert Trivers, the distinguished evolutionary biologist, has just produced a book on self-deception and the evolutionary benefits of self-deception. I can't remember the title because it's one of those many books where the title is different in Britain and America, which is a scandal, by the way. That should never be allowed. I have actually, on occasion, bought the same book twice. And even worse than that, you know how Amazon puts up, if you like this book, you'll probably like this one.
But Richard,
yeah.
If you're an author, that's a very good thing.
Well, okay, that's a good thing. Anyway, Robert Trivers wrote this book on self-deception, where he makes the point that actually it is an evolutionary advantage to be optimistic and to believe that you're more intelligent than you really are, better looking than you really are, etc.
Yeah.
So there is real merit in what you've said.
Let's move on. I guess it's this side, right?
Okay. I mean, this is a follow-up to the earlier point, and it's really where I left off with the God delusion, and you talk about the origins of religion and how we have amazing creativity and we're able to imagine things that are logically possible but not proven, and the point that people do need to believe things that they don't have direct evidence for, and that have, I mean, basically.
Okay, so what's the question?
My question is this. It's a biological question and it's a practical question. If 90% of the people on the planet are turning to religion to get through their lives, how do we, because for me it was easy. Once I watched an episode of Cosmos or read a few lines of Mr. Dawkins' book, it was obvious. I didn't have any more questions, but I have a lot of time to spend on this. I'm relatively wealthy compared to most people on the planet. How do we practically get people whose lives are miserable, who are struggling to survive, and who are clinging to life so perilously, to be able to come to a level where they have an understanding, at least basic understanding, of the world we do live in, such that they can make their own decision and don't have to be victims of religion and just slaves to
Well,
that
thank you.
easy reality.
Thank you very much.
Easy story.
And by the way, that was absolutely crystal clear, so I don't know whether the engineers have tweaked something and got that right, but I could hear every word of that. It's funny you should mention 90%. I mean, it's approximately true that in this country, in the United States, 90% of the population does believe in God. If you look, however, at the members of the National Academy of Sciences, who are the elite scientists, or indeed if you look at the equivalent in Britain, or the British Commonwealth, it would be Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, about 90% of the members of the Royal Society are atheist. So it's an exact mirror image of the population at large. Now, your question is, how do we take people who are unfortunate, who are poor, who are suffering, who don't have the advantages that some of us have, how do you wean people off the crutch of religion? Note that it's completely illogical to say that because something is comforting and reassuring and consoling, that makes it true. It's an astonishing fact that people will, many people will say, oh, I believe so-and-so because it would be intolerable if it were not so. I believe so-and-so, I believe in God because I couldn't bear, rather like you said about wanting to live in a universe that has a God in it.
But if he showed up, I'd believe in him.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. People will say, you sometimes hear people say, well, I tried Christianity. That didn't seem quite right to me. I didn't feel right with Christianity, so I tried Buddhism and I tried Hinduism. Who cares what you feel like? Who cares what feels good? Who cares what makes you feel comforted? Who cares what helps you sleep at nights? What matters is what's true.
Okay, let me try and suggest a kinder, gentler response to that in some sense. Although I think it's really important, and it should have been said at one point tonight, and you said it, but I want to make it reiterated. The lesson of science is that the universe doesn't care what you like. And it doesn't care what you want. It is the way it is. And if we could just convince people of that, that would be profound. But I think you've hit it, obviously, a major problem. I think there are two practical potential approaches. One is, many people, you were just in India, and I've lectured in India, for example, and I see these kids. I've never felt more like I was going to be crushed by kids interested in learning, because they realize that if they become scientists or engineers, it's their ticket out of poverty. It's their ticket to improve the quality of life in their country. And so if we can educate people to learn to the point that science can provide a way out of poverty, then I think in the long run we're going to head in the direction away from superstition. The other thing, and I once wrote a piece in Scientific American called "Educate Women, Save the World," and I really mean that. I think if we look at probably the major way to improve society, it is looking at those societies where women are subjugated, and usually because of religion. And if we can educate women, we'll find, first of all, the birth rate will go down, and secondly, that they'll do a much better job of ensuring that their children are educated and improve their quality of life. So one of the areas okay, yeah, we don't have much time. I appreciate the applause, but we've talked about this. That one of the areas that I actually think atheists, quote unquote, could, and we're talking about ways of doing this right now, could make an effort is to work against the subjugation of women and which is largely due to religion.
That is so important.